Hello. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. My name is David Brown, Director of Programs at Baeck Institute, and on behalf of our Executive Director, Billy Weitzer, I want to welcome you all to the Baeck Institute. If you don't already know, we're a library and archive focused on German Jewish history, and you're at the Center for Jewish History, where we work with our partners, Yeshiva University Museum, YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, American Sephardi Federation, and the American Jewish Historical Society. We all have collections related to various aspects of Jewish history. I'm also very grateful to Yair Mintzker for being here, but before I introduce him, I just want to let you know about two events that I think you'll find very interesting, particularly if tonight's topic was enticing enough to bring you out into the cold. I think you might want to just remember these and maybe write them down on your calendar. We haven't announced them on our website yet, but that's coming soon. On April 4th, we're going to screen a long-lost and recently rediscovered silent film from 1924, based on a novel by an Austrian Jewish writer named Hugo Bettauer called The City Without Jews. And this was a sort of satirical work of speculative fiction that the plot is fairly easy to guess based on the name, but it's significant because of the way it anticipated the sort of course that anti-Semitism would take in Europe in the ensuing decades. And this has just been rediscovered in the archives and restored, and it's had a few screenings but not many. We're going to be showing it here with commentary by Noah Eisenberg, a film scholar formerly of the New School and now at the University of Texas. And on May 30th, we're going to return to the topic of Süss with a lecture by the University of Vienna film scholar Frank Stern, who's going to focus not on the Nazi propaganda film of the 1940s, but on a lesser-known adaptation of Leon Feuchtwanger's novelization of the Süss story, Power, that was made in Great Britain in 1934 by the émigré director Lothar Mendez and starring Konrad Veidt. So that's on May 30th, and City Without Jews is on April 4th. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Yair Mintzker, professor of history at Princeton University, who focuses on the history of early modern and modern Germany. Born and raised in Jerusalem, Professor Mintzker received his M.A. in History cum laude magna from Tel Aviv University in 2003 and his Ph.D. from Stanford in 2009. He's won many awards, including the Fritz Stern Dissertation Prize and the Urban History Association Best Book Prize in 2014. And tonight he's going to tell us about his second book, The Many Deaths of Süss, or Many Deaths of Süss, an innovative work of what has been called polyphonic history that tells the story of the trial and execution of Süss, or Joseph Oppenheimer, from four different perspectives based on the accounts of contemporary observers. And after he talks about his research and his book, we'll take some questions, and then we'll have a reception out in the Great Hall. And I hope you'll all take that opportunity to look at the display case that was put together by Baeck Institute's Director of Collections, Renata Evers. And it's a small exhibition of materials from the Baeck Institute Library and Archives related to the story of Joseph Süss Oppenheimer, including, I think, one of the sources that Professor Mintzker used in his book. So now I'll hand it over to Yair Mintzker.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you, Baeck staff, director, and everybody. You hear me better now? Good. So thank you, David, very much, and thank you all for coming, and thank you to the Baeck Institute for this invitation. So about a year ago, I published a new book about the execution, the trial and execution of Joseph Süss Oppenheimer, the notorious Jew Süss. And what I would like to do today is kind of situate this book, tell you what is the background for it, what is at stake in writing about Oppenheimer, both in the 18th century and today. I want to tell you something about the incredible sources that this trial left behind. It's really something that is truly extraordinary, but it comes with certain problems that historians need to cope with, and I want to show you both what the sources are and how I deal with them. And then towards the end, or actually it will take the bulk of my time, I want to tell the story of Oppenheimer indeed through two different perspectives, to show you how even when the sources are very problematic, we nonetheless can know quite a bit about what happened to this court Jew back in the 18th century. So actually I have quite a lot on my plate today, so let me just jump right in. So Joseph Oppenheimer, one of the most iconic figures in the history of anti-Semitism. He was born in Heidelberg in Western Germany. Here is a map. Let's see if I can do this. It's really, here we go. So something around here. Probably in the last decade of the 17th century. I'll get to that in a second. And for quite some time, he doesn't have any exceptional life. Germany, of course, doesn't exist as a unified state in the 18th century. This would happen in the 19th century. And in this part of Europe, there are over 300 more or less independent states, city-states, etc. Some of them are rather large. Think about Prussia or Bavaria or Saxony. Some of them tiny. There are even some independent villages in this place. The joke in the 18th century is that some of these principalities are so small that they are made up completely out of borders. Yes. And so Oppenheimer is born into this world, in a small Jewish community in Heidelberg, and for a while there's nothing really exceptional about his life. We know something about his father, a tax collector, something about his mother. And then in the 1720s, he becomes a court Jew, which is basically a financial advisor or banker to one of the innumerable princes that lived in this world. He is in Karlsruhe for a while. He spent some time in Frankfurt, that has the biggest Jewish community in German-speaking Europe. And then in 1732, he befriends a man named Karl Alexander, a Catholic, who a year later would become the Duke of the small German state of Württemberg, which you can see behind me. It's a middle-sized German state. It needs its court Jews too, so it needs people who would be able to raise money if the local estates refused to do this, which was very typical in Baroque Europe. It's also typical today, incidentally, when the Congress refuses to pay for something that the prince wants. This is actually a very Baroque kind of story. And so anyway, the prince is a Catholic. Oppenheimer is a Jew. The duchy itself, Württemberg, is Lutheran, so there's a lot of friction in terms of confession and religion. But still, for a few years, things are rather going rather well for both the prince and his financial advisor. We don't know exactly how much money Oppenheimer is making in those years, but we have an estimate, right? We don't have access to his Bank of America online account or any kind of printouts, but we do know that, for instance, in 1735, Oppenheimer buys a house in Stuttgart for 15,000 gulden, which I assume means absolutely nothing to anyone except me in this room. But, just for comparison, you could buy a whole residential house in the city that year for 600. And he buys what is essentially a palazzo for 15,000. So surely he has a lot of money. Anyway, in 1737, what started as a success story takes a very bad turn. The Duke dies suddenly of a heart attack. That same night, Oppenheimer is arrested by the local estates, the Lutheran estates in this duchy. They put him on trial. He is held for 11 months in prison, in different prisons in the duchy, interrogated for 45 days, both in the morning and in the afternoon. And then finally, the verdict is read. The verdict doesn't tell us a lot. Actually, it tells us very, very little. You can see a picture of the reading of the verdict right behind me. This situation right here. This is Oppenheimer, and these are the judges. The verdict is death. the crime, general misdeeds against prince and country, whatever that means. And then a few days later, the man is led outside of the city, just north of Stuttgart, where today is the Nordbahnhof, and executed in front of 20,000 people, more or less. It's an interesting number that can be verified by the sources. It's interesting because 20,000 people have watched the execution, but there were 15,000 inhabitants in Stuttgart that year. So you can imagine a lot of people coming from elsewhere to watch this spectacle of the powerful court Jew who was executed in such a way. This was a big story even in the 18th century. You can imagine the number 2 in the state falling in this way and being executed. But it became an even bigger story in the 19th and 20th centuries when Oppenheimer's story became a metaphor, a parable, if you will, for the story of German Jews in general. And this is what makes the Leo Baeck Institute a wonderful place to host this particular talk, because all the ingredients of the larger story were present here. This is a man who tried to fit in and failed. This is a man we know who dressed in a regular courtier's clothes. When they arrested him, they took an inventory of everything he had in his house. So we have a list of his clothes and his books and his pictures, of the bed sheets, of everything he had in his house in Stuttgart, that house that cost 15,000 gulden. We have a list of it. So we know how he dressed. And he did not dress in a classical Jewish way. This is a man who had definitely some romantic relations with non-Jewish women. He really did want to fit in. But then, of course, everything fails. He's caught, he's interrogated, he's imprisoned, and he is murdered, essentially. So, if instead of telling the larger story of German Jews, in kind of abstract terms, if he wanted to use a specific case to tell the story, Oppenheimer was perfect. And so, over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, whenever this, the question of Jewish emancipation or assimilation, political questions about Jews came to the fore in Germany, the story was kind of resurrected. And you have novels about him, and a famous novella from 1827 by a man named Wilhelm Hauff. I'll come back to him in a few minutes. There is the great novel by Leon Feuchtwanger from the 1920s. By the way, Feuchtwanger in one of his letters says, just shortly after the assassination of Walter Rathenau, right? He says, I wanted to write the story of Rathenau, but I couldn't figure it out. And so I went back and resurrected the story of Jesus. You see how, they go back to the story in order to say something about the present. It's very important. And of course, a movie in 1934 in Great Britain, and the famous, notorious 1940 Nazi propaganda movie made at the behest of Joseph Goebbels, the Third Reich's propaganda minister. Now, after the war, the director of this movie, Veit Harlan, was himself put on trial for crimes against humanity, no less, for having created this movie. It's an extraordinary case in post-war Germany where essentially an artist is put on trial for crime against humanity, no less, for having created something. And I want, as a kind of way, somber way of bringing yourselves kind of into the mood of this talk, I want to show you a short clip from this movie just so that you see what this is about. This is a movie that until today you can't screen in Germany publicly without a government permission. In the States we have a different system. So let me see if I can pull this off in terms of the technology. I'm very good with 18th century sources, but not as good with this. So what you're going to see are basically the last 3 minutes of the movie. Oppenheimer will be arrested. You'll see the judges deliberate his case, and you'll see the final and very famous scene. And then I want to say a few words about this. Let's see if this works. So, and I apologize, this is not a happy topic, so don't expect anything super nice. So the Duke dies.
Alexander! Hilf mir doch einen Arzt! Ein Arzt! Alexander, Alexander, was machst du denn?
Er ist tot.
This is Oppenheimer.
Halt, Herr Oppenheimer!
Nach dem Tode des Herzogs geht die vollziehende Gewalt an die Landstände über, bis der neue Herzog gewählt ist. Im Namen der Landstände erkläre ich euch für verhaftet.
Da sitzt da nun der unselige Jude. Monatelangen Verhandlungen hat er nichts weiter für sich vorbringen können als Lügen und immer wieder Lügen.
Was er mich hier beschuldigt, habe ich nur getan, auf Wunsch und Befehl von meinem Herzog. Im Freibrief steht's drin, er braucht's nur nachzulesen. Ich bin nichts gewesen wie ein treuer Diener von meinem Souverän.
Ja.
Leid spricht nicht recht. Auge um Auge, Zahn um Zahn, das ist nicht unsere Art. Fragt nur das alte Reichskriminalgesetz, da steht's für alle Ewigkeit. So aber ein Jude mit einer Christin.
So aber ein Jude mit einer Christin sich fleischlich vermenget, soll er durch den Strang vom Leben zum Tode gebracht werden. Wo sich aber ein Jude mit einer Christin fleischlich vermenget, soll er mit dem Strang vom Leben zum Tode gebracht werden. Ihm zur wohlverdienten Strafe, jedermann aber zum abschreckenden Exempel.
Ich bin nichts gewesen als ein treuer Diener von meinem Souverän. Was kann ich dafür, wenn euer Herzog ein Verräter gewesen ist? Ich will ja alles wieder gut machen. Ich schwöre es euch. Nehmt euch mein Eis, nehmt euch mein Geld, aber lasst mir mein Leben. Ich bin unschuldig. Ich bin nur ein armer Jude. Lasst mir mein Leben. Ich will leben. Leben will ich. Leben.
Die Landstände verkünden durch meinen Mund den Willen des württembergischen Volkes. Alle Juden haben innerhalb 3 Tage Württemberg zu verlassen. Für ganz Württemberg gilt hiermit der Judenbann, gegeben zu Stuttgart am 4. Februar 1738. Mögen unsere Nachfahren an diesem Gesetz ehren festhalten, auf dass ihnen viel Leid erspart bleibe, an ihrem Gut und Leben und an dem Blut ihrer Kinder und Kindeskinder.
Once is, I think, plenty, right? So what I want to say about this, first of all, I want to say that during Holland's draw, so after the war, the question arose over and over again by Holland himself mainly. Why would he, of all people who collaborated with the Nazis, or Nazis themselves, by the way, he himself was not a member of the Nazi party or anything, why would he be singled out and put on trial for crimes against humanity for something like this? And one of the things that Holland said, which I think are very telling about the man, he said, look, I'm not the only one. I'm not the first one to create an anti-Semitic work of art, as he called it. If you put me on trial, you should put Shakespeare on trial too, right? For the Merchant of Venice. This comparison between himself and Shakespeare, I think, is very telling about the kind of personality that Holland had. Yeah. But I want to show you something else. I mean, the response, by the way, of the state attorney was that what matters is not that you said something like this, but that you said something like this at this point in time. Yes, in history we say context is king. It's not only what you say, it's to whom you say it and when. And I think there's a lot to be said about this. Now, if I trusted trusted myself, I would. Let's see if I can actually do this. Of course not. But at the end, when the judge tells us about the verdict and say, we should remember never to let Jews back in, and our children and our children's children. I hope you could see. He's looking a little bit like this. He's kind of, he's trying to see us in the audience, as it were, in 1940. Because this message is not about the 18th century, of course, it's about 1940. Germany and its relationship to Jews. So the first thing that is clear and simple and I think straightforward is to say this is a case in which you take an old historical case and you kind of try to make it relevant to a new audience. But there's another thing in that scene that I showed you that I think is really remarkable, and you need to pay close attention to see it, and I want to try and show it to you by going back to the scene. And they told me to go here. And I'm going to show you basically just a few seconds from the moment that Oppenheimer is pushed into the cage, into this gibbet, and is being raised onto the gallows. And I just want to show you this in slow motion, just to kind of highlight something that I think is really important and also a little weird. So let's see if this works. Okay, so it's without sound, yes? So Oppenheimer is pushed, and then they change the perspective, and people look at you, and the camera is moving out. Remember, Oppenheimer himself is being raised onto the gallows, right? So Harlan, who would be accused of crimes against humanity, no less, for a few seconds during the execution of Süss, shows us the scene from the perspective of Joseph Süss Oppenheimer himself. And this is completely counterintuitive. Because if anything, we do not expect the Nazis going to do this. I promised you that I'm not very good with technology, and I was proven right. Here we go. I think I may have, now that you're here. Good. This is just so you see a poster of the movie from 1940. And this is Harlan after he's acquitted. Interestingly enough, it didn't hurt him that, as it turned out, that the judge in his criminal case was himself a former member of the Nazi Party. A kind of a classic post-war German story, by the way. Anyway, so I just want to emphasize it's very strange that we see for a few precious seconds in this notorious movie the execution from one's perspective of the victim himself. This is anything but what we would expect from a Nazi movie, so keep this in mind. One last thing that I want to say about the movie is that as it unfolded, about the trial, as it unfolded, Harlan's trial in the late 1940s, there was a media circus. There were reports about this in the newspapers all the time. There were radio recordings of the trial broadcasted in Germany. And people from all over the world, not only from Germany, but also from Haifa, Israel, to San Francisco, California, would send letters to the judge and court telling them what they think about this case. And all these letters can be seen today and read in the State Archive in Hamburg, where the trial took place. And these are amazingly interesting letters in which someone would say, I remember I was 14 years old at the time, I took the U-Bahn with some friends in Hamburg, and we saw the movie, and this is how we felt, and so on and so forth. So very interesting accounts of what happened. And among those hundreds of letters sent to the court, there was one in particular which I read and I thought was really interesting, and I want to show it to you because it's kind of curious. And many of you read German, so actually this is really bad, probably very difficult to read, but I'll help you. It is sent by Wilhelm Hauff, which is interesting because it's the same name as the man who created the novella from 1827, remember? And it is, as you see, 1949, 10th of March. It's directed to the Honorable Court. And then you look and you see, aus dem Jenseits, from the hereafter, yes? Hauff supposedly runs to the court, raises his voice from beyond the grave, joining the accusation against Veit Harlan. And why do I show all this to you? First of all, because it's interesting, even though it's not what my book is about. But second, because I want to kind of make it very clear to you that when we speak about the case of Joseph Süss Oppenheimer, we do much more than speak about the case of an 18th century poor Jew, right? This is something that became much, much bigger over the centuries, over the years, than the particular trial of 1737-38. And finally, and very importantly, we saw Judge Sturm in this movie talking to us, the audience, in the 20th century or 21st century. We saw an executed or about to be executed quote-unquote criminal describing his own death, as it were. We saw the execution from his own perspective. And we saw even a 19th century writer writing to us from beyond the grave. If you kind of adding all these different aspects of the case together, what you see is the understanding that in Oppenheimer's case, it's as if time itself moves in strange and unexpected ways. There's something very weird going on here. So what about the original trial? What about what happened in 1737 and 38, or in the 1730s in general? Now, 10 years ago, when I started working on this book, I went to the State Archive in Stuttgart, where they still have the original trial records from the trial. And it was unbelievable what I saw there. I was not the first one to see it, but I was the first one to write about this. In the basement of the archive, which they were kind enough to take me to, I saw over 130 boxes of documents containing overall more than 30,000 pages of documents from the time period of the trial. This is about yay high, and you can see this is number, I believe, maybe it's number 64 out of 131 such volumes. Sometimes it's loose paper, sometimes it's bound. So if you put all of them together, if I may be a little theatrical, and if you put all these pages one side by side, and I start here, work so hard? Why assemble all this stuff? But it gets actually much more interesting for the historian, because I spent a few days looking through this, and it turns out that that was the least of my problems. The real problem was that when you start reading those trial records, it seems that you cannot trust anything anyone is saying. By the way, during the trial, Oppenheimer himself, we know this from those among those 30,000 pages, there are some reports of the guard in prison who tells us what Oppenheimer is doing and what he's asking. He's asking for food, he's asking for tea, all kinds of stuff. And one of the things that he's asking at one point, he says, give me paper and ink and feathers to write down my side of the story. And the judges in this case say no. So we don't have his account, not that I would necessarily believe everything he says, but we don't have his side of the story. We have other people describing what happened. And when you read what they say, it turns out they contradict each other all the time. And sometimes they even contradict themselves to such a degree that as an historian, as a professional historian, you want to say, this is just too much. Let me find a much easier topic to write a book about. So let me give you just a couple of examples. How old was Oppenheimer when he was arrested? He himself, if you look at the protocols of his interrogations, right, 45 days, mornings and afternoons, if you look at the 1,000 of pages, you will find that at one point he says, I'm about 40 years old, which means that he was born probably around 1697, maybe 1698. The judges in this case, after studying the documents for about close to a year, reached the conclusion that he was born actually 10 years earlier. And there's a third group of documents that suggest that he was born in 1693, so somewhere in between. Now, we don't have baptismal records of Jews, obviously, from this time. We can't really know. So if you go to Wikipedia, you'll see a date, but it's not clear that this is the correct date. It's up for grabs. It's up in the air. Or how did he look on the eve of the execution? One of the people who saw Oppenheimer just a few days before the execution describes him as an emaciated figure, so brittle, that's an exact quote, so brittle he threatened to crumble if you touched him. It was basically a sack of bones. And then there are people who say, no, this old courtier, this court Jew, was as fat as ever. Incidentally, no one says that he was in between. Yes, either very thin or very fat, but nothing in between. How do you judge? And this is my favorite example because it really brings you into the House of Mirror, which is this amazing archive about Oppenheimer's trial. A few days before his execution, again, he meets a man named Christoph David Bernhard. There's a lot about Bernhard in my book. Leo Baeck in the library have an account, 2 copies of the account of this man's description of his meeting with Oppenheimer just a few days before the execution. It's a fascinating document. It's unbelievable. Anyway, Bernhard tells us in this account that Oppenheimer had told him, to Bernhard, that he had lied during his interrogations. Yes, so imagine, Oppenheimer is telling Bernhard that Oppenheimer had lied. So those 45 days of interrogation, those thousands of pages of protocols, maybe they are all lies and we should just throw them out the window. So let me see if I can get this right. So option number 1 is that Bernhard is telling us the truth and Oppenheimer had lied, in which case we can't trust the 2,000 pages of interrogation pages. Option number 2 is that Oppenheimer lied, but not in the interrogation. He's lying to Bernhard now. Maybe he wants to come up with a new story to save his skin. Option number 3 is that it's not Oppenheimer who's lying. It's Bernhard who's lying when he says that Oppenheimer had told him that he had lied, which still doesn't mean that Oppenheimer hadn't lied to begin with. Yes, there's a kind of Talmudic pilpul that that simply never ends. Or I don't know how many of you will get the pop culture reference. This is a classic case of Princess Bride style battle of wits. I guess for this audience it doesn't. Princess Bride, a very different story from Justus, but one of the best movies ever made. Anyway, so what do you do in this case? What do you do when you can't, on the one hand, a very important case, amazing sources, so much. I mean, how many people would kill to have so much stuff about their topic of research? But then when it comes to figuring out what the truth is, what do you do? And so, this book I wrote, instead of making an executive decision whom to believe and who not to believe, looks at this story from 4 different perspectives. When I can, I do tell you what I know. And there are many things that are clearly incorrect or outright lies, and we know about this because we have the documents to prove it. But in those cases where it's unclear what the truth is, I think it's better to leave the contradictions in the text rather than pretend that I know something that I don't. So, you will have in the book 4 different accounts that describe in a Rashomon-like William Faulkner kind of way the story of the trial, everything meticulously documented, nothing is made up, yes? But nonetheless, an attempt to get closer to the truth without always telling you what really happened. This is the major difference between this book and previous works on Oppenheimer, where you don't even see the contradictions, they just tell you what they decided was the case. And what I would like to do with the rest of my time is to show you how this is not some kind of postmodern relativistic way of saying everything goes, but a way of actually getting pretty close to what happened without pretending to know everything. And I want to do this, the book takes 4 different perspectives, and I want to very briefly discuss 2 of them, but just for the record, the first one discusses the case of the judges. So the judges themselves who work for 11 months and create this archive of 30,000 pages and come up with a story of what happened. We have to understand the story, obviously. But there are other stories that are equally interesting. The second one is by Bernhard, the man who met Oppenheimer on the eve of the execution and whose work you can see outside in this small exhibition. He writes the most interesting, psychologically revealing account of Oppenheimer on the eve of his execution, and even if not everything there is truthful, we learn a great deal about what happened. We have there, number 3, the only Jewish account to have survived centuries of what happened to Oppenheimer. Up until 2013, we thought that such a document never existed, but it was discovered, and the book contains the first thorough analysis of this extraordinary document. Incredibly moving, my favorite part of the book, if you ask me personally. And finally, there is a discussion of the first biographer. I'll get to him later at the very end of this talk. So just to, we have the Inquisition or the judges, we have the psychological revealing account, we have the Jews, and we have the first biographer. And the idea is, if you look at Oppenheimer from up close and far away, from a Christian and a Jewish perspective, with people who knew him throughout his life and people who basically never met him, if you kind of add all of this together, you can't see, despite all the contradictions and prevarications, you can't see certain things about Oppenheimer that are both true and I think even quite profound. And so without further ado, let me show you some aspects of two of those perspectives. The first comes from the judges themselves. So this is not the American criminal justice system, very far from it, but it's a sophisticated criminal justice system in which you have inquisitor judges. Now, inquisitors, we hear this word and we always, think about the Spanish Inquisition or something like this. Let's leave this aside. This is not what we have here. We have people whose job it is to professionally look into the case and decide what the truth is. So it doesn't have a jury. You don't have a jury there. You don't really have a professional defense attorney, but you do have people whose job it is to figure out what happened. And Philipp Jäger, whose picture you can see behind me, he is the head of the Inquisition Committee in this case. He's the head judge. This is the man who interrogated Oppenheimer 45 days, both in the mornings and in the afternoon, and creates an amazing archive that is worth looking at very closely, and as I do in the book. Now, we don't have Oppenheimer's perspective. We do have the perspective of the man who condemns him to death. Can we trust anything this man is saying? Jäger is born in Schorndorf. I see that it's really difficult to see, but this is Stuttgart right here. This is Schorndorf, about half an hour by S-Bahn today. One of many small towns in Württemberg in the early 18th century. This is a picture of the town from the outside when Jäger is born, towards the end of the 17th century. And unlike Oppenheimer, this man leaves an amazing paper trail, right? We don't know exactly when Oppenheimer is born. There's a lot of stuff about his early life that we will never know. Jäger is a different story. He belongs to the patricians of this duchy, and so he leaves a paper trail. We know who his parents are, their parents, great parents, all the way back to the 16th century, even before. So a lot of stuff about him. And it's interesting. Already when he was 10 years old, this was 1717, Jäger was singled out as a very talented student, so that it was the 200th anniversary of the Reformation, 1717, 1517, and the 10-year-old Jäger is holding a speech, a lecture, if you will, in front of all the townspeople, 2,000 people, and the text survived somehow. Yes. So we know what this 10-year-old in front of 2,000 people is saying, and he's saying stuff like, let me just quote, he says, we thank Luther and his church for freeing us from papal darkness, and that he replaced the heavy cloudy skies which blocked the sun of Jesus Christ's justice with the light of the gospel. He talks about sexuality. He speaks about how he acknowledges the fact that man's original sin was washed away by Jesus Christ, and a lot of other things. And you could just imagine this 10-year-old, those of you who have small children, just imagine this 10-year-old standing in front of 2,000 people and talking about sexuality and theology. It's really unbelievable. And then the paper trail continues. And I'm going to show you quite a few names now. I don't expect you to remember any of them, and I hate to sound like a phone book, but believe me, there's a reason I do this, okay? So he goes to gymnasium, to kind of a preparatory high school in Stuttgart in 1723, and these two gentlemen, Bardili and Riga, are his teachers, his close teachers. Then he goes to the University of Tübingen. He spends 4 years at the university and leaves it in 1728 with 2 doctorates. Those of us who have a doctorate, it was a very different story back then. Actually, until the early 20th century, a doctorate in Germany would be equivalent to a senior thesis, basically, in today's colleges. He got 2 doctorates in civil and canon law in 1728, but he's a very successful student. He does it still rather quickly, and he studied especially with two gentlemen, Halbrecht and Schöpf, which he even visited in their houses, and we have records of this. I mean, the records are exceptionally well preserved. Then he becomes an advocate on the highest civil court in the duchy, and he's involved with these 5 men who, have different functions in this court. And finally, in 1735, so a few years later, he doesn't get a job really. He's an advocate for a long time. It really is frustrating for him, as we'll see in a second. But then in 1735, he's involved in a major trial of the mistress of the former duke. The story is that she was not unlike Oppenheimer, a foreigner, a Catholic, not a Jew, but a Catholic in a Lutheran duchy, and she makes a lot of money and she brings a lot of people in, and then she falls too. And who are the judges in her case? All the people who are marked in red, and all the people you see behind me, both in white and red, will be the judges in Oppenheimer's trial, including Jäger himself, so the main judge. So what I'm trying to say is, we have never looked at the judges in this case before, which is extraordinary. Yes, we always try to figure out what Süss did or did not do. But what about the judges? Well, they all know each other very well. They are professors of each other, yes. They worked together for years before this. And just 2 years before Oppenheimer's trial, they are all, to a man, involved in a different case that involves someone who looks suspiciously similar to Oppenheimer. Right? She's not Jewish, but she is a foreigner. She is the mistress, so she's very high in the hierarchy. And Jäger is the person who prosecutes her. And not only this, she manages to escape with her life after paying a huge sum of money to the Duke. And who lends her the money? If not our friend Joseph Süss Oppenheimer. We're talking about 150,000 gulden. Let me just remind you, he buys a house for 15,000, and a whole residential house in the city that year costs 600. So he lends her 150,000 gulden, with which she basically buys her life. Yes. So we see that this is not a kind of a general clash between Jews and Gentiles, or something like this, or Germans and Jews, as if Jews were not German, by the way, but in fact, a kind of almost a Städte-like situation where people who know each other for years are involved in 2 trials, one after the other. And this is only, I'm kind of warming up, because when you see what Jäger, as the principal judge in this case, the inquisitor judge, what he asks the 2 people who are imprisoned, first kreven, that's her name, and then Oppenheimer, you see that he's basically asking them the same questions. And here are some examples. We have the questions. We can compare the documents. So we would ask first the kreven and then Oppenheimer, since when has it been that nothing was allowed to happen in court without him or without her? He actually just changes the pronoun. That's the only thing he does. Between 1735 and 1737. Or whether she, at first, and then he, had not had herself or himself chosen and named the person to the government. Or whether she or he had not threatened those who, in opposition to his or her written verbal orders, did not want to obey, and so on and so forth, and so on and so forth. So what we see here is not only that all these people know each other, but that in fact, in a way, the story that the Inquisition Committee would come up with in 1737 had existed 2 years earlier, but applied to someone else. The script for Oppenheimer's trial had existed before Oppenheimer was arrested. Yes? Without knowing exactly what Oppenheimer himself did or did not do, we see, the script was already there. It's, I think, very telling. And finally, and I think very interesting, in contradistinction to Oppenheimer's trial, one of the things that Jäger in 1735 accuses the mistress of is the abuse of courted Jews. Yes. So first of all, he says you should not treat Jews like this. And then 2 years later, he's involved as the principal judge in what would later become the most famous trial of a Jew in the 18th century, and one of the most famous trials of a Jew in general. Yes. So maybe the Jewishness of Oppenheimer was not as important in the original trial as we tend to believe. Okay? This is all, very briefly a kind of exercise in showing you that you don't need to pretend to know what Oppenheimer did or did not do to be able to say something very substantive about this case. By the way, this is the Krevenitz. This is Christina Wilhelmine von Krevenitz. She bought her freedom with Oppenheimer's help in 1735. She moved to Frankfurt and then she moved to Berlin and led a fairly happy life until her death. Oppenheimer at one point during his trial is trying to do the same. He offers the Inquisition Committee a large sum of money. I'll give you everything I have, just give me my freedom. And they say no. And I think you can see there some of the grudges that they held against him for having helped the original, the original person who was put on trial, that is the Krevenitz. I can talk on and on. Let me show you one last thing about Jäger, who's a fascinating figure. At one point in the trial, he goes to a house of a woman and interrogates her by himself. He breaks every rule. They have rules of how to conduct an interrogation. He goes without a scribe, without any witnesses, just he and her in her house, in a closed. That's what he writes. And he produces this document that you see behind me, and I don't expect you to be able to read any of it, but I do want to show you, because I think it's visually very, very interesting, how this is how it goes. You start with a question and then an answer. How old are you? I'm 23 years old. Is it true that Oppenheimer forced himself on you, blah, blah, blah? You ask her this twice, and I think it's impossible for you to see this, but here you can see the 9. No, he didn't do anything to me. But then, he's obviously frustrated, and he stops the back and forth, and he moves to prose, and then in the third person he says, and then she told me that yes, at one point he pushed me on the bed and forced himself on me, but he didn't. Very, very graphic sexual details. This man who, as a 10-year-old, remember, was talking about how Jesus Christ helped us wash our original sin and so on. This is now him alone with a woman describing what she supposedly, allegedly had, what kind of intercourse exactly she had with Oppenheimer. It's also indicative, because he was not a scribe himself, he was a judge, that you see this ink blots. That's also a sign of his incompetence in a way. So as a kind of material document, also very interesting. But enough of Jäger. I want to kind of draw to a close by mentioning a different case, even more extreme than Jäger. I said, we know that all these documents are not telling necessarily the truth. Obviously, sometimes very far from it. And certainly of all the documents I've seen over the years, the most extreme case in this regard are a series of conversations that Oppenheimer had with different people after he died. Yes? So Oppenheimer dies, and he goes to the land of the dead, the Reich der Toten. And there he has fascinating conversation with a series of people. I would have loved to be a fly on the wall and to hear him speak with Shabtai Tzvi. Yes? 4 different accounts, over 300 pages of conversation, where they speak about, where they were born and what they did and did not do, and so on and so forth. So, can we extract any kind of truth out of this crazy stories? And of course, I wouldn't be standing here and talking about this unless I thought that the answer is yes. Why are they so interesting? First of all, because they do describe certain moments in Oppenheimer's life for which we have no other documentation. So they're clearly based. They're written by a man who clearly knew his stuff. For instance, when Oppenheimer was brought to the city from prison, the best description of what happened during this transfer, where he was shackled basically, and people threw stuff at him and yelled at him, all kinds of things, comes from one of those conversations of the dead, where Oppenheimer supposedly is saying, and then they took me, and they put handcuffs on me, and they drove me to the city, and this is what people said about me. So there are descriptions. But more interestingly, perhaps, they make an argument. And the argument is, it's a very popular genre in early 18th century Germany. And that's just the argument that in court society, yes, in a courtly context, you cannot believe anyone. This is why everybody has to be dead. Only the dead actually tell the truth. And if you want to know what happens at the king's court or the prince's court or the bishop's court, whatever it is, you need to have people who are very close to what is happening, but you also want them to be dead, because otherwise you cannot believe what they say. And so you have moments in those conversations when, for instance, Louis XIV had a conversation with Leopold I, something like this, and one of them is trying to tell an obvious lie, and the other would slap the other person on his face and say, Why do you do this? We are all dead. There's no point in lying anymore. So they do make an argument about the kind of world we're living in here. So in the 18th century, and remember, one of the problems that we have with the source is exactly this problem, that you cannot believe what anyone is saying. Finally, when you read those strange documents, you see something that reminds us in a way where we started. Right? I showed you a clip from the movie, and I said, how strange is it that Harlan, this war criminal in a way, shows us for a few seconds the case of Oppenheimer from his own perspective. And these conversations do the same. Oppenheimer is telling us, I was born here, I did this, actually usually very, very negative depictions of how he stole and how he raped and how he embezzled funds and stole and was a traitor and so on and so forth. But still, everything is in the first person singular. I did this. Yes? So the author of these conversations is telling the story from Oppenheimer's perspective. And this is, I think, a really, really important point that goes well beyond the case of Oppenheimer, and even more than just the case of Jews and the violence that was perpetrated against them. Because especially in the English-speaking world, I think, we have the tendency to believe that when there is a major conflict, whether it's a personal conflict or communal conflict, the first necessary and maybe even sufficient step in order to solve it is to be able to look at the world through the other person's eyes, right? I like to paraphrase Paul McCartney here and to say that many of us believe that if you can only see it my way, we can work it out. What you see in Oppenheimer's case and what you see in Harlan's movie and what you see in the 1940s and 50s more generally are lots of people who literally sometimes look at the world through other people's glasses, literally walk in other people's shoes, have an amazing ability to imagine the world through someone else's eyes, know exactly what happened to them, and still have not an ounce of morality in them. Maybe the idea that if you just adopt the other person's perspective is insufficient, and maybe even, it's not about morality at all. The chess player needs to think a little bit like the other chess player, a lot like the other chess player in order to beat him or her. The hunter needs to think like the deer in order to capture it. And so we find also in the history of anti-Semitism, whether in the 18th century or the 20th century, people who are amazing at this, but who have no intention to sympathize really with the victim. And I want to conclude this talk by reading to you a short scene from one of those conversations, and I'm going to put a picture from Oppenheimer's execution from 1738, just so that you have a sense of the scene itself and how it looks, and read to you how Oppenheimer in 1738, in the land of the dead, as it were, describes his own death. 4 of the executioner's men then dragged me up the ladder. 2 held my arms and 2 held my feet. When I was halfway up, my hat fell off my head. It was as if, acknowledging the men's efforts, I wanted to pay them my respects. I cried, perhaps 100 times, Adonai Echad, Adonai Elohim, my one and only God, my God and Lord, be kind to me. I am so weak. This is from a conversation of the dead where Oppenheimer acknowledges, confesses all the horrible things he'd done. But the spectators interpreted my words quite differently, because when I called Echad, they only heard the ach, yes, the sigh. And when I yelled Adonai, they heard hinein, that is, inside. And so my Adonai Echad turned in their ears into ach, not inside, that is, please not into the cage. Yes, you see how even then you have these different interpretations of what's going on. The executioner's men continued dragging me farther up until they reached a point they deemed high enough. Already days earlier, they had prepared the cage for me. It had been fastened to the top of the gallows. Here, in just a few moments, I shall find my last abode. The cage had a door that opened in my direction, and inside it had a hook fastened to the roof, which the executioner could reach by way of a long specialized pole. I did not move. I did not know what to do. The executioner fastened one end of the rope to his pole, made it pass through the hook inside the cage, and put the noose around my neck. All was ready. Then someone whispered in my ear, "Jump, you damn Jew," and I was pushed down, thrown down the ladder, into the air, making such a jump, the likes of which I had never done in all my life. A jump into that abyss between human time and eternity, between this world and the next. It went well, everyone thought, and all the spectators acknowledged that the executioner had done his work well. As soon as I gave up my last breath, my neck was broken from the fall. The executioner pulled the rope and dragged my dead body up into the cage, turned it so that it faced in the direction of Stuttgart, and closed the little door behind me. This is how my last scene in this Teatro Mundi ended, my last scene of this world's stage. I was dead. Thank you. I'm very happy to take questions. Yes, please, sir. Right. So, I mean, there are lots of stuff in those questions. So, the first question is, what are the Nazis trying to say in 1940 versus what happened originally? And I think, in the context of the 1940s, and you'll have a discussion of this, I guess, in May, what they're trying to say, what Goebbels and Holland are trying to say, among other things, is that, all German elites were involved in the story of the robbing of the German people too. So it's a story about the replacing of one elite with the other. Originally, it's not about the Duke stealing, it's about a contestation that was very typical in 17th and 18th century Europe between an absolutist ruler, or a ruler who had absolutist aspirations, and the local estates, so the local corporations. The Duke wanted to create all kinds of, he wanted to have more soldiers, he wanted to have fortifications, he wanted to have new palaces. And the estates didn't want to pay for this. So you see that tension. And then the question about blood and sexual intercourse and stuff like this. This is a central theme in the movie of 1940. In the original trial, much, much, much less so. In fact, many of the things that you would associate both with 20th century anti-Semitism and with classical anti-Jewish feelings such as, host desecration, murder of, Passover, and so on, are non-existent here, which just stresses the point that what is happening here is more related to court intrigues, as in the case of the mistress, than about the fact that Oppenheimer himself was a Jew. This was, I think, made everything worse, but was not necessarily the cause of it all. Yes, please. Yes, it's a very important point. So because the story stands for something that's larger than itself, we tend to reduce its complexity. And it's fine, this is how we tell a story. We can't tell everything, right? The map cannot be as big as the earth, yes? When you look at the documents, you see that there were dozens of other Jews and many other non-Jews who were involved in this case. When they arrested Oppenheimer, they broke into his house, arrested him, and arrested everybody else who was there. We have their names, 55 people. Some Jewish, some not. when it came to the positions of witnesses, some of the, it's actually a very important part of the book, some of the people who defended Oppenheimer were non-Jews, said he had done nothing wrong. And then you had Jews. It's a hard thing to say, and I told you this thing about technology is unbelievable. And then there are Jews. It's hard to see it and to read this and to acknowledge it, but there are Jews who participate. And why? Not because they're evil people, because this is a court society, and they want to, they need to feed their children, and the fall of one court Jew is the occasion for the rise of another one. And so you have people both in Stuttgart and elsewhere. Sometimes they even, travel dozens of miles from elsewhere, from one of the other principalities, to give a testimony against him. They think they can make a quick buck out of it. And so I think the important thing is the dividing line, the battle line in this case, are complicated. It's more than just Oppenheimer against the world. But they're certainly not about whether you're Jewish or not. It's about different factions at court. And this should be understood primarily as a court story, and not as a classic or either modern or pre-modern anti-Semitic trial.
Two questions, but I just, the thought occurred to me, I've read several statements online statements by white supremacists bemoaning the fact that beautiful Ivanka is being corrupted by evil Kushner. Yeah. Anyway, two things. How was the film distributed and by the Nazis, and what was the reaction among the German with the German population's reaction? And I have the film. I haven't been able to bring myself. I keep putting off seeing the whole thing, but I've seen bits and pieces of it. I'm just wondering your interpretation. So I'm saying this without having seen the film, but that scene that you talked about where the camera, pulls back, is it possible that an interpretation would be that the crowd looks so sincere and there's a refinement about the crowd? This is not a mob scene. This is very controlled, very disciplined.
Right.
So is it possible that that Holland, what was his function again? Was he the director?
Yes.
That Holland was making a statement, in a way that contrasting the ennobling the Germans as opposed to this Jew who is writhing in the cage as he's about to die.
Yeah. So let me start actually with your comment, because historians usually don't like to go and say, this is like what's happening now. I'm especially me, huge nerds and like to do our own stuff, and that's it. But court society, the court is a sociological phenomenon, is not unique to the 17th or 18th centuries. What happens is you have a figure in the middle of a system that usually is kind of weak, has lots of authority, but is actually weak. Such figures tend to attract certain kinds of people. This can happen in academia. I've seen it myself. I was the victim of it in a way, of a kind of, sometimes we call it a feudal society, yes? Of a really important professor who tries to control his students or her students by kind of pitting them one against the other. And it happens court, we say Hasidic courts, a religious figure can create a court, and also in politics, both in the 17th century and today. And it's really quite interesting. I wrote a short piece, kind of half jokingly, that all the classical characters of 17th century Baroque intrigues are present in modern day America. You have the sons who are in the long shadow of their father. You have the beautiful daughter, the princess. You have, with Spicer, you have the court jester. With Bannon, you have the evil advisor. And you have the bankers. They're all there. It's not because history repeats itself. And it's a joke and it's funny, but it's also a sociological truth here. And that is the dynamic of the court. And the second thing I would say, there's a lot in your questions. I would say that when it comes to the movie, it was very successful. We know that over 20 million people watched the movie in occupied Europe. We know from Gestapo reports what happened when they did this. Goebbels himself was very interested in the impact of what he did. And these are documents that you can read in both in some published. If you want to read one Gestapo report, in a book called a source book of the Third Reich, edited by Anson Robinbach, who's I'm sure known to many people here. You can see one of the reports from Hungary of how people reacted when they watched the movie. It's very interesting, very sad.
So I have a question about the archive. First of all, it's almost stereotypically thorough, apropos documentation, German national character, and so forth. But my real question, I think you said that you were, if not the first, to really work with this material, among the first. It's such an astonishing treasure trove that I'm curious that no one before you really mined it. I wonder if you might, as a historian, speak to that, at least briefly. Thank you.
With pleasure. So, first of all, let me make clear, I'm not the first one to use the archive. Two wonderful, wonderful historians have done this before me. One is Selma Stern, who wrote the first modern biography of Süss, and she did this. The archive was closed. You couldn't consult the documents until the Weimar Republic. And when the archive was opened, Selma Stern, a wonderful Jewish German historian who had to flee to America at one point, used it to write the first biography. Interestingly, she never discusses how many sources she saw and how many contradictions there were in the sources. And I think she was it's a great book, but it's captive of its own methodology of this idea that the historian should tell you what happened without any contradiction. I think you can write a great, if I may say so, a great book of history that trusts the reader's intelligence and engagement to paint a more complex picture of how we know what we know. The other question about why we even have all those documents is also fascinating because it needs to be explained. And I would say just very briefly that what you see, the very fact that we have so many documents, if you follow what the Yair and his friends are doing basically day by day, because they left us the records for it, you see that in a way they had this preconceived script of what Oppenheimer had supposedly allegedly done, and then now they wanted to find the evidence for it, but they couldn't, both because he was a very smart guy and because the evidence wasn't there. And so they keep working really hard and interrogate over 200 witnesses and send letters to all the world and his wife trying to find something. And so the 30,000 pages is the evidence in a way, the sheer magnitude of it, that they couldn't find a smoking gun. And then after 11 months, it was an expensive investigation. They shut it down and they say, we're going to do what we wanted to do all along. Another thing that's important is that they're also after the money. It's really important for them to find what Oppenheimer had. They know that he had a lot of money, but they can't find it. So part of this, it's almost always the case that questions about property are involved in these cases. Just to give you an anecdote, the 15,000 golden house that he bought, the head of the court, the president, it's a ceremonial position, von Deisberg, he moved into that house, even during the trial. But he's a man of the law, right? Ordnung muss sein. And so he pays rent for the next 10 years. That rent is 5 gulden a year.
I'm not sure that I fully understand what you were addressing at the beginning of your talk. where you said, why was it necessary to have 30,000 pages if you just wanted to kill a Jew?
Mm-hmm.
And so you say just now that there were, many interrogations, 200 people, so on. But I still think the question is open. Why did they feel they had to go through that entire process when it would have been much simpler to have ignored it? What was the motivation to create such a paper trail, really?
Right. So, I already gave you two. I mean, I spent almost 100 pages in the book trying to figure out Jaeger. He's a big part of the book. So I gave you two preliminary answers. One is he's trying to find a smoking gun, but he can't. It's really important for him. And the other, he's looking for the money. And I would say the last thing that relates to the previous comment and question. He is a man who believes, he went to law school everywhere. He's a man of the law. It's really important for him to legitimize what he does. A word that he uses repeatedly. He says, we need to legitimize this. It needs to look a certain way. And therefore he goes through, even though he eventually fails because he can't find the evidence. It's important for him to at least give the impression that this is about some kind of rule of law, which is of course very different in that respect from what the Nazis would later do when there's no trial and everything is done behind closed. This is a very public process, the trial in this world.
So I think we have time for maybe one more question, and then we can continue the conversation outside at the reception.
I'm curious about some of the prints. The first two prints you showed and this print. Can you say when they were made? And then I have a follow-up.
This is we know a few things. I don't know a whole lot about the prints. We know that the one behind me was made by an Augsburg printer by the name of Elias Baeck. The first two I showed you were made by Stuttgart artisans in the year after the execution.
And you don't know the date for this one?
This must be from 1738.
Okay, so they're contemporary.
Yeah.
Because a number of years ago, the Metropolitan Museum in New York had an exhibit of different illustrations relating to the history, trial, etc. of Süss. A fairly rich exhibition. I don't know if you saw it.
Yeah.
And it gave the impression that this was something that had an impact. I don't know if one can say broadly in parts of Europe or just in Germany. So do you have any sense about the iconography behind this history and its contemporary impact?
I would say two things. First of all, the Inszenierung, yes, the props, the scene itself, is not just a matter of the depictions. It's also a matter of the execution itself. So that it's staged in a certain way. Remember that towards the end of the Conversation of the Dead, Süss supposedly from the Beyond the Grave said, "This was my last scene on this theater of the world, this Teatro Monte." It's a world where everything is staged. Our world is also staged in interesting ways, but their world was certainly like this. So you can look at how they stage the execution, and from a material perspective in a very interesting way. And it has been done a few years ago by a very bright young historian. In terms of the impact, I want to be careful. I mean, we have a tendency with Süss, with other figures in Jewish history, early modern Germany especially, to project backwards a lot of the concerns, let's call them that we have from the 19th, 20th, and 21st century. This is true in Oppenheimer's case. This is true in the case of the Wandering Jew, Ahasver, in other cases. From what I saw, the impact was mainly local. That is in southwestern Germany. There were reports about this elsewhere, but much less than you'd assume, I think. There is a great book by Baba Gerber about the reception of this story in the 18th century and beyond. and you'll see most of the items she discusses are from Stuttgart and from Württemberg. And by the way, they stop in 1740, really. So a lot of stuff, hundreds of poems and pamphlets, and for 2 years it's a big deal. But then 1740, there's a major conflict throughout Central Europe, the War of the Austrian Succession, and most people have other concerns, and that's really where the story subsides, and it's picked up again, really, in the early 19th century with the question of emancipation on the agenda.
Well, thank you so much, Yair Mintzker, and thank you all for coming. I just want to stress that we have Professor Mintzker's book for sale. So just you can see me right outside if you're interested in picking one up.